So I'm trying something experimental, which is not always a great idea, but I wanted to discuss particular management lessons learned from our research, especially connected to the 2017-2018 drought in the Rio Grande Basin, but also intersperse some of these specific observations on sort of managing for drought with some sort of broader kind of 30,000 foot lessons learned from what's now 5 years of research in the Rio Grande. So I'm going to try and sort of weave these together, and we'll see how well this goes. But this is probably not the most conventional kind of talk. So put on your seatbelts, I think. So I want to start with a quote from one of the water district managers who I interviewed in the lower Rio Grande Valley for this project. And this person said, "Yeah, that's what I tell people all the time. On paper, I got a lot of water, but when I'm on allocation and I'm having to give it to the city, guess what?" And this came into play in the allocation years. Guys like me that had the sugar cane and the citrus, and I had the need to water crops. You're obviously going to use your in-house district allocation up very quickly. So I would buy water from other districts that were available. Some of the more city populated just had water to purchase. We paid a pretty good amount for it. But hey, I got a cane crop to keep alive. I got a tree out there that needs water. Yeah, I'm going to pay a little more for this water to store it. But even then, it was a risk. It's kind of like you said, my bucket's empty, but on paper, I look real good. The Rio Grande Basin is teetering on permanent drought and faces what Dettinger wrote about in 2015, the largest climate change water supply deficit among the 4 largest Western basins in the US. This was sort of one of the foundational concerns and principles for us at the beginning of this 5-year project, is trying to make sense of how we can think through climate change, over allocation of water rights, the particular engineering concerns, and then the interweaved political obligations that run through the Rio Grande Basin, and how they might be adding to the problems associated with climate change. And specifically, what we wanted to look at then was how much fragmentation impacted the Rio Grande. And really, we wanted to look for cases where we were seeing what we termed whole river thinking. And by this, I mean the sort of willingness to consider local concerns about the river as being intimately tied to processes, people, and ecosystems that might be very, very far away, from the Rocky Mountain headwaters to the Gulf of Mexico. Also at the heart of this project at the very beginning was a pretty fundamental question, in that we were asking ourselves, where are the successes across the system? And we documented many successes. For any of you who've heard talks from me before, or any of my colleagues, or those of you who work in the Rio Grande, you know many of these successes. Some of them are personal, individual farmers who have switched to a far more sustainable way of irrigating cropland. Some of them are collaborative. The sort of now, I think, somewhat famous cases of the Audubon Society or the Nature Conservancy working with a number of actors in order to sort of address ecological concerns within this rather complicated system. Some of those successes were across state, were country borders even. But what we found really difficult was to see a pattern in these successes. And without a pattern, it was difficult to imagine how to make those successes sustainable. So the question I ask myself now after 5 years of work in the Rio Grande is, what is the point of documenting successes if we cannot say how representative and reproducible those successes are? When does an anecdotal success become held up as a pattern of success? And I keep asking myself, shouldn't we also be thoroughly documenting all of those conflicts that have not been mitigated in order to understand what we're truly up against? And so the talk I'm going to give today is not a talk about successes. Um, that may or may not be popular here. But I think it actually reflects the a lot more of the realities that we're seeing than than if I purely focused on successes. Um, at the heart of much of this, what I'll talk about today, is sort of the fundamental driver of wicked problems. I'm sure most of us are very familiar with the term wicked problems, in that they are problems that are being ill-defined, kind of elude techno-scientific solutions because those problems are entwined with multivalent, often conflicting human needs, wants, and desires. Um, and they really rely upon elusive political judgment for resolution and not solution. Um, and at best, they are only resolved over and over again. I always think of this as sort of the response to The Martian, in that we're these are the kinds of problems that you cannot simply science your way out of. Um, so the specifics of today's talk are that I'll talk a little bit about a typology of management, managers, and decision makers that we've been developing in the Rio Grande, and I'll focus on how sort of perceptions of temporal and spatial boundaries both shape and are shaped by institutions and organizational contexts. How the experience of drought often reveals the fault lines of drought systems associated with what I term as the decoupling of management plans or boundaries from connections and teleconnections that create and transmit drought conditions and impacts. This is a very complicated thesis, and I will hopefully be able to illustrate this better than describe it here as I'm trying to move through this somewhat quickly. A little bit on the study background. We explored the role of spatial and temporal variables in the typology of drought decision making through through this work with my former postdoc, Dr. Stephanie Palladino, and myself. We worked doing ethnographic field work in the Rio Grande Basin between 2015 and 17, and then I did follow-up work in 2018, really focused heavily on this 2017-18 drought. So our project was based on 15 months of ethnographic field work. It was all in situ field work, so involved both ethnographic observation, participant observation, kind of going out days on end with people and seeing what they do, not just sort of doing interviews with them. And we had a very expansive view of sort of who we wanted to look at. It started with sort of the broad idea of water managers, but the reality is under water managers, we had a lot of other, we really were looking for anybody who controlled a lot of water. That included just farmers. They're sort of heavily represented in our study, as well as a number of other more traditional managers and decision makers. I put up this slide simply to show kind of the spatial scale of our interviews. We did interviews, and I mean, this is kind of broken up into counties, but literally we had interviews in every single county that that went along the Rio Grande and into a number of the regions in Mexico. connected to the Rio Conchos. Um, so one of the big take homes that we learned from this project is uh, that rather than managing the basin as a set of interconnected parts of a river, the river was profoundly fragmented in many, many, many ways. Um, there were the dams that led to hydrological fragmentation, political legal fragmentation associated with the interstate and international treaties that adjudicated the flow of water through the region. Ecozone fragmentation might not be the best word here, but from a management standpoint, it made things fragmented across 13 ecoregions, made a unified vision of managing ecological needs nearly impossible. Disparate ecosystem services, especially the fact that the river is over allocated for human use, with around 85% of the water being consumed by agriculture alone across being used to irrigate an area that's about 5% of the basin. With no sort of, and this is a little trickier now to say, but no legally designated water for environmental flows. I know in New Mexico, this is a more complicated statement to make because of some of the innovations that New Mexico's made, but what I term cognitive fragmentation, sort of associated with the way that individual actors and communities construct mental models that really have normalized and reinforced the fragmentation of the river. For those of you who know the Rio Grande, this is the common narrative that there is not one river. There are two rivers, or other people will say there are three rivers, or some people will say that there are five rivers, depending upon where you want to start to draw those lines. The consequences of this extensive fragmentation on the Rio Grande have been dramatic. In a recent study by Blythe and Schmidt, they show the extent of the transformation of the hydrological flow regime in the northern branch of the Rio Grande. The estimated annual flow has been reduced by nearly 95% due to intensive human use, most of which was made possible due to large dams meant to store snowmelt-derived water in order to rationalize the distribution throughout the year to water rights holders in New Mexico, Northwest Texas, and northern Mexico. The reduction of flow has almost completely eliminated annual seasonal flooding that was critical to maintain geomorphology, sediment flow distribution, and critical river and riparian habitat health for species. Our ethnographic work, though, wasn't the only thing that we were doing. The vast majority of our time when analyzing our data has been spent working with a team of ecosystem modelers, specifically driven by Dr. Jennifer Koch. And so our ethnographic findings sort of feed into this ongoing modeling effort across the region. I'm not going to have time to talk about this today, but critically, our collaboration started by building our conceptual model from inductively generated findings and relationships between system components, work that we published in 2019, and where we kind of describe the process of working across disciplinary boundaries in order to represent with the greatest fidelity the social data that we gathered during our research. So before I go on to the actual details of the drought, I just want to go back to this map, which I showed a moment ago. This map kind of demonstrates to me the pervasive presence of kind of a naturalized view of the river as fragmented and not whole. This map was actually provided to me early on in our study by a scientist who was very enthusiastic and supportive of the need to study the link between social and ecological problems across the Rio Grande. This person circled all of these places on the map and described them in terms that reproduced what I think of as kind of the fragmented nature. The person said, this is the San Luis Valley. You need to make sure to study that. This is the northern, these are the northern reaches in New Mexico, and then the areas south of it, and then these areas near the border with Texas. And so we walked through all of these things. To me, I always find this interesting because he did not put a circle around the area that this large red arrow is pointing at, just something that I added to the map, which is the 198-mile Forgotten Reach, an area of the Rio Grande that is, for all intents and purposes, dry most of the time, because the water from the Rockies is consumed long before it reaches that area. It's this kind of, this map has ended up being a touchstone for my work because it so perfectly kind of demonstrates the very problem, this kind of balkanized way of thinking about and managing water across the basin that I wanted to study and problematize. All of which leads into the drought of 2017-18. So again, I want to start with a quote here from one of our interviewees, in this case, a county water resource manager in New Mexico, who said, "What I really, really appreciate about the people who've lived here for a long time, Hispanics, is a generosity of spirit. But I feel like they're torn about that these days, because on the one hand, it's their nature to be very kind, generous, and encompassing of their community, and also they're feeling very overrun. So there's tension there. I would say more in Santa Fe itself, mostly between Hispanics and whites. And then you go out a little further south, there's a tension between the Pueblos and Hispanics, is huge mistrust. Well, I think anytime growth comes up and water comes up, then that's where the tension is. So the person basically is linking all these tensions back to growth and water. The idea of whether there is enough water and whether the choices of where a community is going is going to cause there to be enough water, can I still be generous without knowing if there's enough for me and my people, my family? So around decisions around water and growth. Under normal conditions, the Rio Grande is a snowmelt-derived, gravity-fed hydrological system with snowmelt from the Rocky Mountains feeding a length of the river from Colorado to Fort Quitman, Texas. Water being stored along the way in a number of major reservoirs for engineered redistribution through the region. In 2017 and 18, though, the region faced severe drought that limited snowpack quantities to such an extent that little to no surface water made it beyond the Colorado border, leaving virtually no flow of water into New Mexico. Here I have a graphic that I think I'm still playing around with. I'm not sure if this is a final graphic. But in essence, the left column illustrates a range from high snowpack, normal snowpack, and then 3 consecutive drought years. The idea here is that water flows from spring melt during high and normal years, and in high years, surplus water is traditionally being used to target ecological needs, sort of environmental pulses, targeted releases to increase water flow to simulate flood conditions, permitting the greatest benefits for natural systems and periods during which there are the greatest efforts placed on restoration efforts. In a normal year, reservoir releases will approximately equal the flow entering the reservoir to maintain storage levels and meet all demands, while in the first year of a drought, as we'll see in a moment, insignificant or no flow will enter the reservoirs, but releases will approximately equal a normal year as stored water is consumed instead. By the second year of a drought, the deficit from the first year of drought has not been replaced, so releases will decline, impacting human users and compounding a negative relationship with ecosystems. And finally, by the third year of the drought, reservoirs will reach or be operating as if they are at dead pool levels, not releasing any water, having a profound negative impact on human users and increasing the negative relationship between human systems and natural systems. And the far right of this image illustrates how sort of intensively human systems will rely on extractive groundwater to counteract the loss of surface water throughout this. If that graphic was merely a conceptual model for all of this, much of this actually played itself out, at least if you go to that D1, that first year of a drought within the Rio Grande. Many managers reported that they thought that it might be a bad year during 2017-18, but until the growing season, which uses about 85% of the surface water for irrigation, they held out hope for a late snow or the possibility of particularly powerful summer monsoon rains. The drought was so extreme that the northernmost USGS stream gauge in New Mexico recorded flow that was not only lower than the most recent, quote unquote, most devastating drought, at least that's the way it was often characterized to me, that of 2002, but flows that were even lower than those seen in the late 1970s and what's often seen as the drought of record period of the mid-1950s. So what did the water managers do during this period? And I'll start with Colorado, with the San Luis Valley, and work my way down to northern New Mexico. So the small amount of flow from the spring snowmelt in the Rockies was almost entirely consumed by irrigators in the heavily agricultural San Luis Valley of Colorado. Regardless, the flow amounts were still so low that irrigators were forced to supplement surface water with intensive groundwater pumping. The problem with this is that the region is under a mandate from Colorado's state engineer's office to recharge almost 1 million acre-feet of water to the ground. Between 2006 and 2017, almost 350,000 acre-feet of that million that they were required to recharge had been responsibly recharged. So that's over an 11-year period. During 1 year, the 2018 growing season, irrigators drew 200,000 acres of those 350,000 that had been recharged in order to irrigate. The consequences of this I'll describe in a moment when I come back to Colorado. So in northern and middle New Mexico, the situation was very different. I'll divide my discussion between Albuquerque and sort of the middle Rio Grande Conservancy district, the agricultural areas south of Albuquerque, since they are the biggest water consumers in this part of the state. So Albuquerque has prided itself on shifting from unsustainable groundwater reliance to conjunctive water use that draws more than 70% of its water from the Rio Grande. However, most of the water in the Rio Grande main stem used by Albuquerque is actually water that's pumped in from the San Juan Basin in southwest Colorado, meaning that during the recent drought, Albuquerque was able to continue to draw on surface water that was imported through the San Juan Rio Chama diversion from the Colorado River Basin. On the other hand, the Middle Rio Grande Conservancy District, which manages water distribution for the agricultural irrigators south of Albuquerque, drew on stored water in order to meet the needs of their irrigators. They were able to meet all of their irrigators' needs, but at a dramatic cost. By the end of the growing season, they were reduced to a stored bank of water of only 1,000 acre-feet, without much hope of that being recharged unless snowpack in 2018 or 19 was significantly above normal. So all of this All of these details came out of, again, interviews and work with the water managers in the region during the drought. But one of the core questions that I posed to them and that we sort of worked through in each case was what would happen if the drought simply continued for one more year. This is not a fanciful what if. A 2-year drought is not a fancy. So the question of what would happen seemed like a perfectly reasonable question to ask them. And hearing how they worked through this was both important and troubling. Um, um, in Colorado, the response was that there would be almost a complete reliance on groundwater. And probably that would exhaust all of the recharged groundwater that had been replaced in the area. The problem for this, or the problem with this, is that if this continued for several years, irrigators expected that the Colorado State Engineer's Office would step in and begin to decommission wells at such a scale that large-scale agriculture would become unsustainable, something that the state engineer's office had already done in other portions of Colorado. So this was not a hollow threat. And this is just to give you a sense of how much water was consumed during that 1 year. If you look at the last year's um, portion of this graph. Albuquerque would continue to rely heavily on San Juan Basin water, imported water. However, even in 2017 and 18, they did not receive all the water that they were entitled to due to lower than normal snowfall in those mountains. Knowing that drought conditions can affect a wide region, Albuquerque's drought plan is to return to a heavier reliance on groundwater, even returning to a 100% groundwater usage model if faced with a multi-year drought. The primary problem with this is that the reason why Albuquerque shifted to heavier reliance on surface water in the 1990s was that there was significant subsidence of its aquifers. So a long-term drought would lead to devastating effects on Albuquerque, and it would not only use up its groundwater reserves, but also collapse its aquifers, so it could not recharge those aquifers. Agriculture in New Mexico's Middle Rio Grande is guided by a shared suffering principle. Unlike Colorado, where the sort of water law gives priority to first in use rights holders. Additional years of drought would trigger this system. However, given the fact that the region has almost no water in reserve after that first year of drought, even if it benefited from some borrowed downstream flows from Albuquerque, there tended to be a great deal of cooperation between Albuquerque and the Conservancy district. This water would have little impact on irrigator needs, thus leading to massive agricultural losses and the loss of critical habitat for endangered species. So how do we make sense of this within the framework of trying to understand how water managers both make decisions and how those decisions might be linked to each other? Specifically, we were looking at and beginning to develop a typology of water managers and drought managers, and thinking about them in particular along the dimensions of time and space. Um, Yeah, temporal perceptions and qualities of drought behavior sort of included many different sort of critical decision points, including the question of when are we in a drought? When should that trigger response? When does management need to shift from business as usual to drought contingency practices? When will a sustained drought overwhelm a drought plan, and what will that mean? And when are we out of a drought, and what follows? Our work revealed a complex landscape of types of drought actors and drought decision-making that fell along different spatial and temporal lines. Some actors and agencies made decisions that spanned seasonal, annual, and even decadal planning and response horizons, like the US government's Bureau of Reclamation, while others only operated within a narrow year-to-year or season-to-season timeframe, placing themselves at risk due to their lack of capacity often. It wasn't a lack of desire, but a lack of capacity to respond to multi-year droughts. So in addition to this temporal component, definitions and perceptions of spatial domains are often critical for defining decision points, including questions like, where is the spatial domain of concern for the management of and preparedness for a drought? Where are the upstream and downstream consequences of drought and the responses to drought? And where are the remote system dynamics that need to be considered? And how are these teleconnections included in drought planning, preparedness, response, and perception? So while some actors and agencies planned, responded, and made decisions based on the local or regional conditions they faced, others considered both local conditions and distant teleconnections beyond political and legal boundaries, and even across hydrological units. The Nature Conservancy, for instance, recognized the need to thin forests in the San Juan Basin in Colorado to protect them from wildfires, because fires there led to erosion and debris in the San Juan River, which in turn had devastating effects on the water entering the Rio Grande from the Trans-Basin region. Temporal and spatial decoupling of the discrete decision-making and action of individual actors and agencies contributed to a number of dramatic conclusions regarding the 2017 and 18 drought in the northern portion of the Rio Grande Basin. From a spatial standpoint, drought decision-making in the region was primarily responsive to local conditions and, with the exception of a few actors, failed to account for teleconnections. As actors scrambled to respond to drought, they mostly remained blind to shifting the costs of their decisions to other upstream or downstream users and systems. From a temporal standpoint, drought plans and decisions did not provide resilience to drought impacts, but rather simply concealed and deferred the impact of the drought. This was primarily because drought managers spent the time scrambling to make the drought invisible to their constituents as long as possible. Multiple actors expressed to me their regrets regarding this issue. As several federal and municipal actors expressed to me, on a certain level, it would have been better to save more water resources in storage and show or demonstrate to people, the public, how they will need to adapt to the new normal of climate change impacts along the Rio Grande, rather than continuing to act like it was business as usual during a drought. Instead, most felt that they simply had to defer the quote unquote pain of an increasingly water limited new normal to some point in the future. So I said I wasn't going to talk much about successes today, and yet the story that I ended up hearing from most of the people who we worked with during this drought and afterward was that 2017-2018 drought was a success. Almost every person I spoke to recounted how the drought was difficult and taxing, and what and who they had to rely on to make it through the drought. We collected a number of stories of collaboration and cooperation and generosity, genuine generosity, I think, getting back to that quote that I read to you earlier. Generosity between different actors. And almost every person who we talked to suggested that the drought response was a success. Mostly, this was viewed as a success because constituents did not feel the effects of drought. But I began asking myself, was this what we were looking for in our study? Was this illustrative of success in the Rio Grande? So I just have a few last slides. These are sort of my final thoughts here. And I'll start with another quote. So my first experience with it was in the 1990s, when we started experiencing drought and the sudden recognition that we weren't getting what we were supposed to be getting from Mexico. And then we'd see satellite imagery. Our agriculture commissioner discovered satellite imagery in Mexico, where they basically turned deserts into oases with our water, or at least that's how we felt. And we've been fighting it ever since. And you don't feel like you get a whole lot of support from the State Department and others in that regard. So that's probably the biggest challenge. So how are we thinking about success in the Rio Grande? Well, I have a very wordy slide here, but I hope it kind of captures some of my current thinking / concerns, things that keep me awake at night. What do we know about the successes to address conflicts in the Rio Grande? Whether those are conflicts between different actors, communities, and regions, or between human needs and ecological needs. How would we characterize them into, for instance, a typology of successes? Are the successes the same everywhere? And if not, what are the patterns of success? I think this has been sort of what's driven a lot of the focus on successes so far. Where have we seen things that have worked? But I would link something to that question. So what do we really know about the conflicts in the Rio Grande? How would we characterize them? Is it the same conflict everywhere? And if not, what are the patterns of conflict? And finally, linking these two, I would suggest, is really the critical next step. What are the patterns that we see between conflicts and successes and failures to mitigate those conflicts in the Rio Grande? Do we know why some efforts succeed and why others do not? Do we know why some efforts cannot even get off the ground while other efforts carry forward to successful completion? This last question is particularly challenging, I think, in my work, because so many of the folks who have had a success in the region, they sort of negotiated something with another partner, and they made sure then that sort of an environmental pulse went down the river, and it was good for the ecosystem, or it was good for farmers somewhere else because somebody wasn't using water upstream, or all of these sort of different cases where there have been these successful collaborations. Most of the time when you dig deep, people don't have a lot to say about them because they're often working on them under the radar because they can't be explicit about them. There are rules that they're working around, or and this then makes it really difficult to understand how you would systematize success. And finally, I would ask, so why is so much effort being spent on studying successes and so little on failure? So do we need a new approach that systematizes the linkages between successes and failures without valorizing the successes and minimizing the failures? Can our successes be more than ad hoc fixes? And finally, can we move from successes based on generosity to a system of successes that will withstand the test of climate change? So that's all I have to say. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jack. We'll go ahead and open it up for questions. You can unmute yourself if you want to ask a question in particular, or you can also